Welcome to Sociological Inquiry. So why in Sociological Inquiry, and in this course, we're going to look at how we do sociology, how we conduct research. What is the way and why we do it the way we do? So why do we need research methods? This is a question that we're going to address here throughout this presentation. So here you'll see that the subtitle is an introduction to the study of the processes of discovery for the social sciences. That is the purpose of this course. So we're kind of going to look at questions such as, how would you find out about things such as if a program that's designed to reduce recidivism was really working? So many of you may not know what recidivism means, but recidivism is when a person who commits a crime continues to go back and commit a crime even after whatever sort of societal response was implemented to rehabilitate that individual. Whether it was incarceration, which is really not based on rehabilitation at all, or if it was some other type of punishment that's supposed to act as a deterrent or program. So how do we know if these programs are working versus those programs that don't work? How do we know? And so you want to think through, what would you do? How would you go about addressing this kind of question? How would you research it? How would you find out? How would you find out if labor unions increase or decrease income inequality? See, these are all questions that we look at in sociology and the social sciences. They're all questions that are important to different researchers and different scientists. What about if political advertising that advocates stopping illegal immigration increases negative stereotypes of immigrants? How would you find out about that? What about if bullying impacts student performance? We would imagine that we could predict that it would impact it negatively. In other words, that the greater the amount of bullying, the worse the student performance. But how would we actually verify it? Sometimes there are things that we think we know, and we assume we know them. But until we actually investigate it, we can't be sure. What about if financial stress increases the likelihood of divorce? How would we find out about that? So that is all very important, and there are all different ways we could address this type of question. Now, there are different methods and different ways of looking at this. So think about the strengths and weaknesses of some of the following ways of doing this. Perhaps common sense is another way, one way that we could find out about that. Unfortunately, that's got problems. You know, we think we know what is common sense. It's common to us, but better. So why would common sense be the best way? Okay, well, it's often biased. It's prone to errors. Appearance is not essence. So when we think of common sense, we generally don't think of those things. We haven't critically thought about what it means to use common sense or how somebody knows. Well, they just say they know. It's just common sense. Well, that's a nice way of skirting the question and avoiding really going deep into finding out how you actually know. So we know that everybody's common sense might be different depending on how they see things. We know that it can be prone to errors. People will make mistakes in how they view things and say it's common sense because they haven't ascertained it. They don't know if they're correct. And we know that sometimes the way things appear is not how they actually are. Remember, science is full of discovery that shows how appearance and how things actually are different, right? So, you know, this is why Marx, who was one of the founders of sociology, Karl Marx, said all science would be superfluous if the forms of appearance of things directly coincided with their essence. He was one of the foremost sociological thinkers, one of the classical sociological thinkers. He didn't coin the term. That was done by Auguste Comte. But this comment, what this means, is really critical. So we know that science is necessary because appearance does not always coincide with essence. What about our personal experience? I know, for instance, that people who receive food stamps do so because they want to take advantage of the government or because they don't want to work hard. I know because I knew somebody who, from my perspective, appeared to do that. Well, there's problems with that as well. And we know that there's a lot of social views that have been informed based on personal experience, but there are several problems with that. One is we're overgeneralizing. That means we take a conclusion, we jump to a conclusion, we take a fact, and we jump to a conclusion based on very limited information, based on selective observation. And based on this selective observation, then, is only selecting those cases that may actually preconform to my beliefs. So I see my beliefs and I see them preconformed in how I interpret and perceive this personal experience. So my observation one is not quite neutral, right? My observation of this experience. But I'm also only remembering these particular experiences that stand out. Generally, it will be those experiences that tend to conform my belief. And that's why scientific approach is very important. Now, what about drawing some conclusions from a news brief or a magazine article, some news article, we read it somewhere? Again, we have some of the same problems. We have a new problem called premature closure. Well, we could get that from the others as well. And premature closure is just the idea that we are stopping our investigation before we go on and get enough information. So we're really stopping at our starting point. And so we haven't even started to run a race and we think we finished it. There's a big problem with that because we need to really gather enough information. The other thing is that, well, how are we selecting our news article from which, we must understand that the news that we consume daily is generally reflects the views of the owners or the board of directors, and there's perspective on there that is conforming to those corporate interests that own most of the media, because most of the media is corporate owned and it's very concentrated. And so that is one important thing. The other important thing is, of course, I consume the news that I like, you consume the news that you like. So how do we know whose news has the right perspective, right? And this seems to be very important today. What about asking an expert? Okay, so I'm just going to go to this person, I'm going to ask them what they think. After all, that's what talk shows do, and it's an important part, right? If you ask an expert in the topic. But we still need to be careful. There are still limitations here. We have the halo effect. This means that a person who is conceived as being an expert is just, wow, he must be right because he's got a PhD or he's got an MD. So it would be as if I were trying to sell you a particular toothpaste or a particular medicine because I have a PhD. My PhD is in sociology. I'm not a pharmacist. I don't have any business trying to sell you a pharmaceutical product. But somebody could say, Dr. Isaac Christensen says. Well, what does that do? What kind of validity does that actually have? So then there's a couple of other things. There's potential funding bias. We can see that the potential funding bias might not be announced and that bias might just have something to do with the findings, right? So we always need to be concerned about conflicts of interest. And conflicts of interest can come in here as well. And finally, the methodology is masked. When you just ask somebody, unless they tell you their methodology, you don't know. And it's important to know how they know. That way you can decipher or distinguish between good research and poor research. So it's important to be able to do that. So all of these things are non-scientific epistemologically insufficient, and often lead to incorrect inferences and conclusions. Thank you.